Okay, so as you can see, this is the RC10 B5M Factory Light Edition. I just picked this up today as a birthday present to myself, basically. As you probably know, I run an RC10 B5, and I run that in the 17.5 buggy class at my local track. And I wanted to just try a mid-motor car, and because I run stock two-wheel drive buggy, the Factory Light would be an appropriate car for that. A couple of my friends have them. They think they're really great. In particular, the 3-gear gearbox, which I can get to either in this video or another video. So I want to try it out, and it might be a little bit late. I mean, I'm usually late to the party on getting more modern equipment, but I will do a build series for what it's worth, because I kind of like doing those things, and I hope you guys learned something from them. But while we're on the subject of 17.5 buggy, I would like to offer up my own personal thoughts on stock versus mod. I think Jason Snyder from RC Short Course did a video on stock versus mod, and it was like a 20-minute video, and he brought up some interesting points, but I think he's speaking more from a California perspective and what the racing scene is out there. And, you know, not all of those points are relevant elsewhere around the country or around the world. I live in the U.S. Northeast, and the types of services we race on are different, and so the relative difference between stock and mod buggy is going to be different. I also have things that I'd like to point out that, with all due respect, he did not point out in his video, so I'd like to give you maybe an engineer's perspective of stock versus mod buggy. So the first thing I kind of alluded to earlier is the surface. Generally speaking, the higher grip level you have, the more of a difference you might expect to see between a stock and a mod buggy or truck or whatever. And the reason for that is because on low grip tracks, if you have too much torque coming out of the motor, you're going to be fighting the motor for traction all the time. So having something like a stock motor, which doesn't have as much torque, allows you to be more aggressive on the throttle and basically get around the track a little quicker. So you would expect to see a smaller difference in lap times on a lower grip, like a loose dirt surface, between stock and mod compared to a super high bite track. Like, for example, what you see out in California. They run really, really hard-packed clay surfaces that are very nicely treated, and you're almost running slick tires on these tracks. And in some cases, you are running slicks. Or maybe in Europe, where you're running on carpet or AstroTurf. Very, very, very high grip. In very high grip conditions, you're not fighting the motor for traction, and so you can use more or all of the motor, in which case, yes, you will see a difference between stock and mod. But that does not necessarily mean that you require a higher or lower driving skill to drive in either class. So I'll get to the driving skill part in a minute, and I think that's a really interesting topic to go over. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about power and weight. So it's important to put stock versus mod into context here. So I did a little bit of research, and I looked at some old RC car action issues and some online articles that I could find. And what I found is, I just made a small list here. There were some dyno tests run on the Trinity Dirtinator 1 and Dirtinator 2 motors in 1997, January 97 car action issue. And these were at 5 volts, and they did it on motors ranging from an 11-turn triple up to a 13-turn triple motor. And they were getting maximum power outputs in the 175 to 178 watt range. Now that's at 5 volts. So if you transfer that to a 7.2 volt pack, which is, 7.2 volts is what you would run in a 6-cell NiCad pack or nickel metal hydride pack back in the day, that would roughly translate to 250 to 260 watts in power output. Okay, and the Reedy TI comes in a similar range, right? You end up with about 235 to 240 watts power output, So something in this range, okay? And the RPM that you get is around 40,000. So yes, if we're looking at total like top end speed, you are getting higher RPM in an old modified motor, and by old I mean DC brushed motor running on, conventional NiCads or nickel metal hydride cells. You get around 40,000 RPM and about 250 watts power output. Now, why am I bringing up brushed motors? I'm bringing up brushed motors because back in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, this was the standard bearer for modified motors, something like a Reedy TI or a Dirtinator motor. These are what the pros were using. These were what world champions were using. They were using motors with these kinds of power outputs. So let's put that into context. Let's consider, for example, this is the Turnigy Trackstar series of brushless motors. They have a nice little table on the back of their motor boxes. This is basically the same chart you would see for the Reedy Sonic, because in all honesty, the Turnigy Trackstar is a clone of the Reedy Sonic. So let's see if I can get the camera to focus here. If you wanted to replicate something like 250 or so watts of power output, that would correspond to a 13.5 brushless motor, okay? And if you wanted to replicate 40,000 RPM top end, that would come down to something like a 6.5 motor, okay? So basically, the old modified motors back in the 90s would have a top end that corresponded to something like a 6.5, but with a power output that was more like a 10.5, okay? So the actual punch that you got out of the motor was like a 10.5, and it would take you perhaps a long time to get up to the top speed that you would get with a 6.5 brushless motor. So you can average that out and say, well, your highest end brushless motors here, and you would typically run something like an 11 turn and a 4-wheel drive buggy, a 12 or 13 turn and a 2-wheel drive buggy. We can average this out and say it's roughly maybe like a 9.5 for these high-end mod motors back in the 90s. But in terms of raw power output, it's actually not all that different from a stock motor, right? This 250 watts or so is equivalent to about a 13.5. A 17.5 motor puts out about 190 watts, depending on the manufacturer. Not all manufacturers quote their power output. So modern stock brushless motors are not that far off in total power output from what were considered at the time to be the highest end brushed motors back in the 90s and early 2000s. And again, these were motors that were considered to be the top end, super crazy modified motors that all the good, all the really fast guys ran. Comparing that to today's motor technology, it's really not that impressive. So if you're going to talk about all the different RC legends out there and all the great, races they won, I mean, to their credit, they did some really good work, but the actual speed of the cars they were driving isn't all that different from what you would get running a 13.5 or a 10.5 in a buggy today. So that's important to point out because cars today are a whole lot faster than they were 20 years ago. So if we're talking about modified motors of today, say a 6.5 today would have a power output on the order of 500 watts, something like that. That's a huge amount of power. That's double the power output of an old brushed motor, okay? So the power to weight ratio of RC cars today is much, much higher than it was 20 years ago. And what that basically means is that if you are running stock buggy today, the power to weight ratio is comparable, maybe even a little bit better, because the batteries are lighter in modern cars, than something like a world championship winning car from back in the day, from the 1990s, for example. So that's important to point out. So just because you're running a stock motor in modern times doesn't mean that you're a bad driver. It just means you're running something different. Which gets us to our next topic, driving technique and the use of brakes. This is kind of an interesting point because with a stock motor, you don't have as much torque as you do with a modified motor. That makes sense. And what that also means is the braking strength with a stock motor is not quite as powerful as what it is with a modified motor. And that in some cases forces you to change your driving technique when you're on a track. So I kind of sketched out here part of the layout that I have in the local track that I race on presently. And the way it's set up is you have this wide sweeper, and you have a single into a hairpin, and there's a small straight with a single jump going directly preceding a hairpin. And then you have a single to a tabletop with a lip at the end, so you can clear the next single and then off onto the rest of the track. So there are different parts of this layout here that you would have to negotiate differently with a stock buggy versus a mod buggy. If you had a modified motor in your car, for example, you could just triple or quad this whole thing just with a blip of the throttle, okay? But with a stock buggy, maybe you can clear it, but maybe not as consistently. So it's probably smarter to check up and do like a single or a single double or whatever you want to call this, right? Get onto the tabletop and then jump over. 2 sequences of jumps there. So what that effectively means is you're forced to think about a different racing line when you're running a stock buggy versus a modified buggy. And that's just this part of the track. Over here, when you're trying to come into this hairpin, well, with a modified buggy, you could just hammer the throttle, slam the brakes before this single, and just kind of, navigate around this turn with using low-speed steering. But with a stock buggy, maybe you don't have quite enough braking strength to slow down in time. So you have to change your technique for how to navigate this turn. Instead of coming in tight and exiting tight and clearing this quad or triple, whatever you want to call it, maybe you have to come in a little bit wider, go off of this jump sideways so that you land sideways and use the lateral friction on the tires to scrub speed off of the car so that you can slow down as a supplement to the relatively weak brakes you have to get around this turn, and then do like a double or single, whatever you want to call this. So the driving technique is different. That's a totally different line that you have to take with a stock motor compared to a mod motor. And I think that's important because if you're running both stock and mod, which I do, I run modified stadium truck, I run modified four-wheel buggy, I run stock buggy, and I'll be running mod buggy soon. So I run pretty much everything. Each time you have to think differently about the line that you're taking around the track. And what that effectively means is that you get more variety. For the same track layout, you're running 2 different lines rather than one line, which is the mod buggy line, right? So if you're interested in having more variety and thinking about different racing lines and how to get the most out of, say, a less powerful motor, or how to adjust your driving technique for a more powerful motor, it's of interest to you to actually run both stock and mod. They're both interesting. And because you have to think about a different racing line with a stock buggy, that doesn't make you a worse driver. It just means you have to think about a different line. If anything, it can make you a better driver because it forces you to be creative with how you navigate around the track. Okay? So driving technique, I think that's a pretty interesting topic here. And by the way, if we're going to get onto this whole driver skill discussion, I should point out that there are a lot of really fast guys who run stock buggy, okay? And they're plenty talented, and they could run mod buggy just fine, but maybe they like running stock buggy, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different type of driving, okay? And now there are other topics that are more, I guess, conventional. Like if we're going to talk about tire wear, of course, with a stock buggy or a stock stadium truck, you're not spinning the tires as much, so the tires can last longer. So that's good if you don't like spending money all the time on tires. Stock motor is more, useful for you. And then there's the cost factor. Jason Snyder brought this up a little bit in his video, and I thought he brought up a good point about how, the original purpose of stock racing was to keep the cost down, right? You have a relatively inexpensive stock motor, and then you run basically a stock chassis, and everyone's more or less running at the same relatively low to moderate speed. But then what inevitably ends up happening, because races are competitive in nature, we try to find ways to lighten the car, to lighten the rotational mass in the drivetrain, to reduce the friction in our bearings, to do all kinds of tricks to get as much as possible out of that stock motor, to reduce as much frictional losses as we can to get the car moving as fast as possible. So in order to do that, you end up spending more money on bearings. You end up spending more money on, aluminum input shafts and aluminum, wheel hubs and titanium turnbuckles and all these lightning things that you wouldn't necessarily need to do with a mod buggy. So the argument against stock that I often see is that if you get into stock racing, you're going to spend so much money upgrading your motor every couple of months when a new, better stock motor comes out, and buying all this equipment for your car that you wouldn't need with a mod motor. Why don't you just put a mod motor in there and call it a day? And, there is some validity to that argument, but it's also worth pointing out that you can run a stock motor in a car fresh out of the box, like my B5, not even B5M, just a B5 I've been running for a year and a half. I can run it completely stock and do just fine, at least at the club racing level. And I think that what sometimes lost in this conversation is that people forget that most of them are club racers. If you're a national level racer, okay, fine. You might see some advantage to reducing weight here or there and having a slightly more powerful stock motor compared to the rest of the guys out there. But most of the time, especially at the club level, if you're running just an everyday stock motor and you have a car that's fresh out of the box, you're going to be just fine. And it really comes down more to your driver skill than anything else. All the little stupid tidbits you put in your car, you don't really need that, okay? That's more bling than anything else. So I personally don't buy the argument that stock racing is more expensive than mod. It's only as expensive as you want to make it. If you want to spend $300 on parts, go right ahead. But it's not really going to buy you anything unless you're a top level racer. Even in that case, it's only going to buy you a very small amount. So the return on investment is low. So if you're smart about stock racing, yes, it can be a lot cheaper than running mod. You're not spending as much money on tires because you're not blowing them out all the time. And you could buy one motor and run it for 2 years and you'll be just fine, no problems, right? So I think those are the main thoughts that I wanted to cover for stock versus mod. The big thing is putting the power output of a modern stock motor into context. If we put it into some kind of historical context, stock cars today, or I should say cars with stock motors today, are comparably fast to cars with modified motors from back in the day. And it's worth remembering that. These cars are lighter and more powerful and faster than they've ever been. So, we're looking at the lower end of what is a much overall higher end picture here compared to what we had 10, 20, 30 years ago. So if you're going to say that people that drive stock motors today have less skill than people that drive modified motors, then what you're basically also saying is that people who used modified motors back in the brushed days in the 1990s are less skilled than the people who use modified brushless motors today. And I'm not sure that argument holds. Skill sets come in aggregate. There's no one specific skill that defines how good a driver is. There's a whole bunch of combined skills that define how good you are as a driver. So stock racing just requires you to use different skill sets or to use the skill sets you have a little differently in order to drive quickly. Okay, so it's worth remembering that. And I just want to make sure we don't forget that. So I think those are the main thoughts I have. Can't really think of much else. So I hope you found this informative. I imagine this will, be an ongoing debate. Stock versus mod, will probably go on forever as far as I can tell. But I want to give you guys my thoughts on it and try to be as logical as I can about it. So yeah, I'm going to end the video here. Thanks for listening to my almost 20-minute rant. And please, post comments. I'd be happy to see how this discussion unfolds. And thanks for watching.